Welcome to the State of Cyber War, a production of the CyAN Secure in Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hi all, and welcome back to part 2 in Hugo Tarrida's and my series on podcasts about encryption, battlefield encryption, and how the nature of early ciphers and decryption technologies in military applications on battlefields in wartime leads to some really interesting, sophisticated, and frightening developments in modern day technology. In our last episode, we talked about, well, I primarily talked about the history of cryptography and cryptanalysis from the early historical times around antiquity, around ancient Babylon, Egypt, 16th century, and thereabouts, to the end of World War II, and the rapid advances in technologies, in processes, and obviously some of the considerations around these. How do we deal with decrypted messages, etc. In this episode, Hugo is going to drive and take us from the early days of the Cold War to the present day. And these are obviously going to be fairly rapid, high-level overviews. But Hugo, over to you. Take it away.
Yeah. So obviously, previously we talked about, for example, Enigma machine being very big in World War II, mainly rotor systems, rotor decryption machines. They were obviously slowly being phased out because of the breaking of Enigma, the new technology. For example, the early versions of computers, by Alan Turing and their system to break Enigma, obviously made a shift in how you would encrypt, but mainly decrypt, which obviously that forced in different methods and ways you could encrypt messages be more secure. And this, for example, was seen throughout the whole Cold War up to now, for example, when there's two big rivals or conflict might happen, encryption, messaging, and just secure communication itself becomes very big, both for defense and attacking. And for example, one example here is how the US was able to decrypt Soviet messages through until the 1980s, mainly because there was a flaw in the one-time pad system, which was used by the Soviets, and just revealed
What was the name of it? Sorry, I think
it's the Venona project.
Okay.
Called. So it's the US managed to find this one-time flaw, the flaw in the one-time pads, and they were just able to exploit it. But obviously, as we mentioned before, they were very secretive about it, not always showing that they decrypted the messages, not always showing and allowing the impact to not be noticed. So, for example, if an event was going down, let that to happen in order to avoid raising suspicion from the Soviets. That kind of counter method to what do you know, what we want the enemy to know, was actually very effective. But then also moving on, you have systems, agencies worldwide being created. So the NSA, which was formed in 1952, mainly to secure communications, cryptographic research, national security, arise not only through and because World War II, but also the increasing tensions with the Soviet Union and the Cold War era.
And by the way, maybe quickly jumping into just in case anybody who's not familiar with it, you mentioned one-time pads before. Pretty much what the name says. So you have a one-time decryption, an encryption technology. When you're done with that particular message, you throw it away and you move on to the next pad.
Yep, it's more or less basically it. Also, due to this, you have different areas, different positions through the Cold War. For example, the very famous hotline, which was established between the US and the Soviet Union, which was mainly due to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which obviously, although is mainly used and is very famous for in very high tension periods or nearly wartime moments, they would contact each other's leaders directly. But obviously, this line was highly encrypted and was in theory only able to actually reach the other person. And so let's say one president to the other without either side being able to tap in. It was just more or less direct. And for example, this type of communication shows that, so not what you mentioned in the first part, which is not only wartime strategic move, but also general communication itself, ways to communicate, contact other people of high interest or personalities itself.
Which gets us back
And
to what we
always,
mentioned last time, which is the difference between the strategic communications, diplomatic cables, and the actual tactical battlefields.
yeah. And for example, as well, just new machines were being made because obviously with the not destruction, but the phase out of the rotor, you have more technological, more computer-like systems. So, for example, the US KW-26 cipher machine, which became widely used in the 1960s, ensured military confidential news and communications throughout well, that time period, which is like a step up, but also developed because of the different use and technologies that were available. There's, for example, different cases through the Cold War. I also want to mention a few, for example, examples of breaking those kind of systems, of those counter, and not mainly decryption, but counterintelligence operations. So, for example, you got the Berlin Tunnel from 1955 to 1956, which is a joint CIA and MI6 operation that intercepted Soviet communications, tapping into underground cables, which obviously links highly to our last podcast on the undersea cables and communications. And although it was the Soviets did eventually find out, for a time period, it also was very highly useful for the US from the British because they were able to collect data, but also, although some of it, or mainly most of it was encrypted, they were able to collect it, decrypt it, and then see what was going on both inside the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain, but also just see how the community itself, different ways they could contact and move around in their own communication systems.
And I'm looking,
Moving on,
I'm looking up the
yeah,
KW-26 here, and it's an absolute beast. Interesting bit of trivia I just saw is that when the North Koreans captured the USS Pueblo spy ship in 1968, there was a bunch of those on board the ship, and in response, the NSA actually changed some of the mechanisms around. So that's actually kind of I wasn't aware of that. Makes sense though.
yeah. For example, I also wanted to mention another point, which is it's once again, it's one of these things that I mentioned before, which I would categorize as like stupidity or lack of awareness. Because, for example, since the 70s till fairly recent, the Cryptology, which is controlled a German Swiss encryption company, which was mainly German controlled, and they sold encryption devices to the Soviet Union. And obviously, they sold them defective devices in order to be easier to decrypt and to know what they were messaging. And I say it's from my point of view stupid because obviously, if you're the Soviet Union, why are you buying Western technology to encrypt your own messages? It's like say, hey, we're going to use your devices to our communications. Please don't tap in, okay? Just let's be friendly. It seems very strange. Like, why would you even buy and use directly? Because they didn't even try to hide it. Would like directly buy these and use them. So it's this kind of things that I'm just surprised that
I
they did
remember
happen.
I was in Switzerland when that was going on. I mean, crypto AG, that was a huge deal, and I wonder whether uh part of that wasn't because there was, I mean, the USSR was so behind the West in terms of general computer technology, that there was maybe a naivete and just kind of an innate trust that their tech is better, so we'll just use it. And the idea of, I mean, the idea of backdoors in that sense, even given Soviet approaches to maskirovka and their own listening technologies and programs, the famous bug and the giant wooden seal that was gifted to the US embassy in Moscow that turned out to have a listening by a bunch of Soviet school children that turned out to have a listening device in it. Um, Maybe, I don't know, maybe hubris, maybe stupidity, like you say, just naivete, lack of understanding of what a backdoor even is.
I mean, I do understand why they might do it, but obviously you can also buy the technology and then like re-engineer it. So go reverse engineer that process to create your own, which obviously I think that was also kind of the point to buying the crypto AG and so on, but they ended up using it much more widely. And obviously, where you're mentioning backdoor, for anyone who doesn't know, is when they leave more of a literal sense a backdoor way to get into the system without the other side knowing, in order to infiltrate it without putting up suspicion or notice that you were there actually listening or just moving around the system. But then moving forward, I mean, I just can't get over this point, to be honest. How the lack of awareness leads to hugely flaws and leak of intelligence everywhere. But then, for example, with the military, with the space race, you have new type of more communication and encryption method, which is more satellite development. So you start now with more, not only traditional, let's say, on writing and so on, but also, for example, satellite communication, images, transference of both intelligence. For example, the satellite networks like the US Milstar and Soviet communication satellites, both allowed for evolving cryptography methods, but also decryption methods. And also, for example, the Echelon program, which was pivotal in intelligence collection, but just both capabilities developed mainly due to the space race, both due to technological advances that both sides had, trying to reach the moon first, but also the side effects of obviously encrypting technology, encrypting messages, intelligence in general, but also trying to decrypt the other side. Just keeps constant evolving, and it was something that obviously in the 60s, 70s was very, very big due to the space race. Then it became more of a side notice, but obviously technology was already developed and was already there.
And now, satellite communications remains a huge topic. We actually, one of our members, Ali Asghar Aaron Porvala, has done quite a bit of work on quantum and post-quantum crypto in the context of securing satellite communications. I'll link to his article in our blog. And there's a lot of European Union specifically, but not only, activity going on about securing satellite communications. So just the fact that there is no way around having wireless comms for critical assets is a major driver in both encryption and cryptanalytical, or avoiding cryptanalytical capabilities.
Yeah, so for example, here there's all the not US, but like Western Soviet interception of messages, which was mainly using the Echelon and Project Parameter, which obviously allowed to exploit weaknesses in the transfer and transmission of strategic data through, for example, satellites and so on. This was allowed and obviously highly exploited. There were small incidents which constantly continued and increased. In the end, the Cold War obviously is a time where high tensions, but not actual war, but they were both trying to undermine each other through mainly intelligence. So communication, encryption, and decryption was highly, highly crucial. And then a bit further, a few years later, now in the mid-80s, for example, you have another boost in technology, which was microprocessors. So there were, for example, militaries built encryption devices like the Taclean series for tactical data encryption. These devices used modular designs, which mainly allowed for updates in cryptographic algorithms, both encryption and decryption, and also give way to more digital data networks, encryption, decryption methods, and ways of doing it. So, for example, here are a few points I have in my notes. For example, the STU-3 secure telephone, which was developed by the NSA, allowed the military and government officials to use digital encryption for voice communication. So mainly for example, phone calls. And I was going to say video chats, but that was another time.
So is this a scrambler that's an add-on to a phone, or is this a secure phone?
I think it's more of a secure phone
Okay.
itself. I haven't dove deep into it. It's more as a secure phone itself.
We'll link to all these things in the notes.
Yeah. And then you have more diving to the end of the Cold War, right? The more starting based on the microprocessors from the 80s, more into software-based encryption. So now you're getting into more techy stuff, more computer-produced encryption, which was already there in the 80s, but started to get pumped up, which, for example, military is embracing digital and software-based encryption highly, like more widespread. And obviously, the introduction of internet and the public and private key infrastructure to global operations itself as well.
And I would assume
So
this also makes it a lot easier to deploy, for example, tactical soldier to soldier or small unit to small unit encryption technology, where you're no longer so reliant on, back to your point about JW26 machines, right, or Enigmas. You're no longer dragging this massive piece of stuff into the field with you, but rather you can do this on anything that can run the software. And as microprocessor technology advances, becomes more miniaturized, you can just run on a laptop or a phone or a device of your choosing.
yeah, exactly. And for example, it's very common to see what we also mentioned in the previous podcast and previous episode, the change in military structure and military behavior itself. From, for example, Napoleonic Roman times of big battles, front just fighting straight on, to more Second World War, blitzkrieg, fast moving, small attacks and taking over key strategic points, to more later on, for example, mid to late in the Cold War, on smaller operative. Obviously, you have exceptions, but more on infiltration, doing the job, getting out without being really noticed, without raising huge alarms and huge warnings about you and your presence being there. Kind of, for example, secure telephones, radio, even computers, which were obviously much more efficient, were not as heavy as, for example, the Enigma machine, were not as big to carry and so on, allowed for these kinds of tactics as well. So smaller groups, just as you mentioned, rather than having big battalions just going into having these kind of infiltrations and moving on.
And I
But
guess
then you also,
that paradigm, sorry, just real quick, I guess that paradigm continued evolving throughout the Cold War, where nowadays, especially in highly sophisticated militaries like the U.S. or the U.K. or France, you're down, or the Israelis, you're down to the individual soldier as a communications node and fully linked in, and that being kind of the ideal of having every unit, every individual fully linked in and fully benefiting from this whole C4. So what was it? Command, control, communications, and computers capability, but also feeding and streaming information back in real time. So
yeah,
I guess that this is really interesting. This from what you described as your Hannibal area up to Napoleonic era, big units wheeling around, getting smaller and smaller and more atomic, and with communications and control, and by extension the need for encryption in real time or decryption in real time for these individuals becoming much more condensed down to the individual soldier, which is the smallest unit.
yeah. Not only that, but also the what you mentioned, the fast pace, not only to encrypt and decrypt, but also the receiving and sending the message itself. That evolving technology on, I call you, I send a location for example, a bomb strike, whatever, you will receive it nearly instantly, and you can just send it there. It also doesn't allow much time to actually react. So although you might have the decryption capabilities, if there's someone already infiltrated, there's like a small group already there, you might notice too late because they're already there. The messages you're encrypting are trying to decrypt at real time. You might already be in an issue, in a danger position while you try to decrypt it. So it's not so much as trying to prevent the attack to know where they're going to be, what they're going to do, but let's say more on that still happens, but it's more on how can we prevent it from scaling up as well? How can we lesser the already damage that can happen? So, for example, there's in the 1986 the Hugo's egg, which is a Western German hacker which used to work for the Soviet KGB, was able to penetrate US systems using compromised passwords. So obviously, passwords were not highly developed in the system, so it was fairly easy to decrypt.
I, I'm
And also,
I'm so happy you mentioned that because I do want to throw in a blatant plug here. Cliff Stoll, the guy who found those guys, who wrote The Cuckoo's Egg, that was the first book I read about security anything, and he currently makes these wonderful things in Berkeley, California, called Klein bottles, and I encourage anybody who's got any interest in geekery whatsoever to have a look at these because he's hilarious and he's one of the funniest people I know. and these things are great. So sorry, I'm so happy that you mentioned the cuckoos. I just wanted an excuse to bring that up.
No, that's great. So, for example, so that sense of password encryption, you have a password, which nowadays, for anyone who's working knows that in my case, I have to update my password every 2, 3 weeks, which is constantly annoying. To come out new one up, we have to come up with a new one, change it. Can't use the same characters. You have to use new ones and so on. Obviously, one of the reasons is the accessibility and how fairly easy it is to crack weak passwords. And obviously, with more and more technology, it's becoming easier to do so. For example, the cuckoo's egg was one of the first times where they were able to do so, and then pass intelligence and information.
Remember. I mean, I remember uh, being told by friends who had connected to government and military systems because I never did that myself ever. Um, I mean, half of these things weren't even using passwords. So the whole concept of security in the early 90s, late 80s was just non-existent in a lot of places. And I mean, I remember, I'm showing my age here when firewalls became a new thing. But it's interesting to see that even though military OPSEC and encryption has a long and storied history, and even at tactical level throughout the 20th century, this has already grown. When we start coming to things like securing critical communications in civilian applications, like this was undiscovered country back in the early days of the internet.
Yeah, completely. For example, I was just going to mention another case, which is something that's very obvious, but obviously one does not think of it, which is what happens when they steal or if the enemy manages to get your encryption machine. So, for example, is the case where the KG-85 encryption machines, which were used by NATO, fell into Soviet hands. Just they had them, so they were able to decrypt the messages using the machine itself. But that's also another issue on not only secure the encryption, passwords, and so on, but also the method of encryption. Obviously, you're not going to take around Enigma if you can avoid it. You're not going to take around your computer into a battlefield, into enemy territory if you can avoid doing that. Just things that obviously it's more a lot of trial and error. Or we did this, let's make it better. Let's not make this error again. But things did happen like this, and it just kept on going and going, and just it still happens, obviously, but at least to a lesser extent, or we know less about it.
This is the interesting thing about a shift to software-based encryption that you talked about before. One of I believe it was Bruce Schneier's salient points about crypto systems is never trust anybody who says they have a clever new crypto system, because the crypto system and the keys should exist separately from each other. And unlike with hardware-based machinery like the Enigma, where getting access to the physical machines and the rotors it uses is already half of the half of the battle, you should be able to get the software and not have that impact the security of the system. And this is one thing. One thing I wanted to mention is, were you ever familiar with RSA and 5 lines of Perl?
Sounds familiar, but can't
This,
remember.
this was a really interesting thing in the early 90s when I was at university. Basically, RSA and crypto systems themselves were subject to ITAR, so American Arms Control Export regulations. And the RSA algorithm and there's a whole backstory about RSA and how various parts, various publicly available crypto systems were intentionally crippled by the NSA. But how that was considered a restricted item that could not be exported. So some jokers made these stickers that we saw everywhere that had RSA in 5 lines of Perl, and the caption, "This label is classified as a munition." And now we are obviously sophisticated enough that we understand that well, if you have access to Diffie-Hellman or RSA or whatever mechanism, whatever crypto system, that should not compromise the integrity of the messages unless you have the key and other parts of the methodology. But I think that's a really interesting observation, that we've been moving much more towards this kind of almost a type of abstraction where the hardware is no longer the issue, the crypto system is no longer the sensitive part, but it's really the keys in the process how they're managed.
Yeah, completely agree. Also, I just wanted to mention as well, one of the big drivers throughout the Cold War towards more encryption, better protection, is nuclear war. So the US developed nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union did a bit later. If you manage to infiltrate the system of the nuclear program of the other side, it's over. In the sense of, if you can not even fire the enemy's warheads, but if you can avoid them from firing, you have an advantage of we will not have been will not see retaliation for our attack. That drive for nuclear protection, nuclear encryption protection, let's say, drove a lot of technological push and also big worry on both sides to we don't really know if the other side, if the enemy has access to our encrypted information and systems. And this is something which I also want to link to our next episode, which is more on future technology. For example, this is a growing worry now once again because of quantum computing. Will quantum be able to break nuclear codes? Will it be able to actually access nuclear programs, nuclear keys of different countries? That same worry which we're seeing now and it's currently happening was the same 50, 60 years ago throughout the Cold War up to like 20, 30 years ago, because you never knew who could have access external, let's say from external access to those nuclear codes, to the nuclear program and nuclear warheads. And that's a huge issue because obviously we all know what a nuclear warhead can do.
Oh,
Huge destruction scene.
you've seen Doctor Strangelove, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for all the movie buffs, the CRM 114 discriminator is a central plot device in speaking of secure communications in with regards to nuclear warfare. So if you've not seen Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, I strongly encourage you to have a look at that. What I find actually kind of interesting is that this then furthermore ties into and you brought up a really good point that I was really happy that you helped me segue into my next point in our last call, regarding contextual factors of battlefield encryption, not only the actual encryption and decryption technology, but what do I actually do with it? And the AI right now, there's a huge discussion in military circles, it's been ongoing for a while, about basically man in the loop and keeping humans in decision-making functions. And your point is a really good one about, well, if somebody cracks a nuclear weapons code or communications, network, like, I don't know, the internet, in its early days, do they have control over nuclear warheads? And I think it's a really important part of the decision of the discussion of, you need to keep a human being in the loop, in the decision-making loop, so that even if somebody manages to crack your codes, and this has always been the case, then you still have a human being who can make that call. And the reason why my face just lit up is I was trying to make sure I had the right name. Have you heard of Stanislav Petrov?
No.
He's the Soviet lieutenant colonel who narrowly averted
He's the one who didn't press the nuclear button. Okay,
who
I know
didn't
the
press
story. I
the
didn't know
nuclear
the name.
button, 1983, right? Because he was a human being who basically made a judgment call for all the risks that bears, that, well, the automated mechanisms don't make sense, and we're not going to kill everybody on Earth because I don't think this is right. So it's really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that the what is the vulnerability of nuclear arsenal to being cracked? Can it, terrorist, right? It would be the worst case scenario. Can they launch it? And you always want to build in that kind of safeguards that even if they do crack your codes, then that's, we're not all going to die, basically.
Yeah. So the story for those who don't know of this, I'm gonna say hero who prevented us to be all in a nuclear wasteland, um, was that within the radar that he was watching, a few objects popped up which seemed to be nuclear warheads from the US, but he did not trust the radar itself. And obviously, protocols said that whenever something popped up and it was like confirmed a nuclear warhead or an attack on Soviet territory by the US to fire back. But obviously, he did not trust the system. He did not press the attack button back. And then it was later discovered that it was actually an error from the radar system that just popped up and randomly, I don't remember what it located, but just identified it as like a missile towards the Soviet Union. So obviously, his judgment was correct and prevented us to all be not be in a wasteland, to be honest. So what you're saying on keeping people on the loop is obviously huge issue. It's just something that obviously we see less and less because we are moving more towards automated, functional AI things and just mechanisms. But having someone in the loop obviously keeps that human decision making, which obviously might not be as fast as a computer as an AI, but would obviously determine and have a, from my point of view, a more understanding way of this might be an error. So we're not going to follow protocol because it might lead to a worse disaster than just might an accident might happen, which is something that's obviously very crucial. And with now, just as we're mentioning, AI, quantum technology, we have just to wait and see how it evolves and keeps changing because obviously having different people in different areas, different loops, different moments is very costly, both in manpower and economic. But it might also be necessary from a few cases we've seen in history, like this one. You might need someone to make the judgment in the end rather than allow an automated system to do it. And then moving on a bit to, now we don't have much time left, to more recent events. We see, for example, how after 9/11, we start seeing more encryption for, let's say, public use used widely. So, for example, VPNs start to be enter the picture much more. Governments also using VPNs for their own private networks, but also maybe mainly individuals who might not want other people to know what they're saying, who they're talking to, which obviously sounds a bit dodgy. But I know I understand that everybody wants their own privacy, just as you have your non-digital privacy. You can also have digital privacy, which is a whole other issue. Became more and more used. But also, for example, the US, another example here, adopted the WWII, which is a Warfighter Information Network Tactical, which just provided a secure mobile broadband communication to troops. It's just more communication systems, but it was more protected. It was also more real time, so it had much less delay. And just these things, the technological encryption keeps evolving. So there's many different cases and points. I also want to reiterate here that in the 2010s, when obviously technology was widely incorporated, everybody had phones, which were already highly developed with internet access, computers, and so on. It was a global shift towards a more of a zero trust secure model. So this means for those who are in the corporate world might understand, those who are not might not completely get it, which is basically don't trust anything. If you receive something you think is a bit fishy, a bit suspicious, you're not completely sure, don't click on it, don't open it. It's better for them to say, hey, you never read this message, than for you actually to make the system vulnerable by clicking on the link, for example. So that zero trust approach, which we still see massive companies still moving towards with different ways, governments as well, moving to that non-trust policy per se, to just keep not only communication and encryption secure, but just day-to-day things secure and manageable without interference itself.
Well, I mean, ultimately, the weak point is not just technological. It is as you indicate, the human being. I mean, the famous point, getting to the very end of the Cold War, which heats up again. Our Russian friends in Ukraine, where their wireless communications were either disrupted or unreliable, so they used their own cell phones using Ukrainian cell phone towers. What could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. Just the human error is just the main and it's only the only constant error in encryption and communications. I think it's, from my point of view, the constant error in humanity. We're the only ones who make the mistakes more over and over again.
Make,
And obviously,
make it idiot proof, and they will build a better idiot.
yeah. So it's just that approach, that shift on we're not only trusting technology much more, the different firewalls, hardware, secure communications, and system which is built on, but we're going to trust less the individual. We're going to treat people as highly vulnerable aspects, which we are, and then secure and get that starting point from there. Just don't trust anything, and then everything will be better. And those things that you trust, don't trust them that much.
Well, I'm gonna be really interested to see where this pans out. So we've seen this really interesting. Thank you for that. So this we only got 3 minutes left. This evolution of technology, of processes, of norms throughout the 1940s and 50s to nowadays, where you have an increasing sophistication, miniaturization of encryption technologies, integration of weapons, and I think that's something that we're going to get to in our next two episodes with a surprise guest who is got some really fun stuff to say about quantum crypto and drones and other developments on the battlefield. Um, Obviously, we're not experts. We are approaching this from the perspective of reasonably informed amateurs. Hugo's got a background in geopolitics. I have one in a whole bunch of areas. We're both active in cybersecurity, and we do a little bit of reading and Wikipedia browsing. And we hope that this conversation, this happy promenade through the history of encryption in a military context has given you some entertainment, some useful information, and we hope that the links that I'm going to include in the video descriptions and podcast descriptions will also get you started on learning a bit more about this fascinating history and set of technologies in an area where the civilians among us may not be that well informed. So with that said, thanks very much, Hugo, for joining again. Thanks for being a good sport. And
It's a pleasure to be here.
yeah, always great to chat with you. And we will see you again in January. Wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, whatever it is that you prefer. And stay safe, stay secure, and visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network and check out our other videos. And that's pretty much it. Take care of yourself. Thanks again. Bye bye.